No maid survived a day with the Alpha King's twins. Not one. And yet here she was, an obese Omega. The lowest classification the kingdom assigned. A woman whose own wolf had been so quiet for so long, she had almost stopped believing it was there. Walking toward a nursery that smelled like scorched wood and grief, carrying a kit she'd packed herself because no one told her what to bring. She had spent her entire life being accurately categorized. That was what she told herself. The stamp on her papers was not a wound. It was simply information. She had learned to move through the palace like water moves through stone. Not forcing anything, not fighting anything. Finding the path of least resistance and staying in it. She had learned to take up exactly as much space as she was given and not 1 inch more. She did not know, walking up those stairs, that she had been made small on purpose. She did not know that the warmth she sometimes felt in her hands, the warmth she had spent years dismissing as poor circulation, was something a powerful man had spent 22 years ensuring she would never understand. She did not know that somewhere in that ruined nursery, 2 small wolves were about to scent her and go completely still. And she certainly did not know that their father, the most guarded king in 4 generations, had a wolf that had been waiting without his knowledge or consent for exactly her scent. She only knew she had a job. She only knew she needed the money. She only knew that everyone said the twins were impossible. Everyone was wrong about her too. But to understand how a woman who had been told her whole life that she was less discovered she was always more, we have to go back to the morning it all began. To a laundry room, a staffing crisis, and a name called from a register without anyone bothering to look up. The morning shift in the lower palace laundry began before the sun did. Wren had been awake since the 4th bell, which was when the boilers needed stoking and the first load of linens needed turning. She was good at the work. She had always been good at the work. There was a rhythm to it, heat and water and weight, and she had learned a long time ago that rhythm was its own kind of peace. She wrung out a sheet with both hands and hung it on the line above her head. The steam rose thick and white. Around her, 6 other women worked in their own silence, and the room smelled of lye soap and warm water and the faint char of the boiler coals. Outside, through the single high window, the sky was the gray-blue color it got just before it decided whether to rain. She did not look up when Steward Parwick came in. She knew his footsteps. Everyone in the lower quarters knew his footsteps, that particular shuffling hurry that meant someone had made his morning difficult, and he intended to spread the inconvenience around. He stopped in the center of the room and opened his register without greeting anyone. "Calloway," he said. "Here," Wren said. He still did not look up. "Reassignment. Effective this morning. Royal Nursery, Upper East Wing." He turned a page. Turned it back. Nursemaid post. The woman beside Wren, Dana, who had been at the palace 12 years and knew everything, went very still. Wren set down the sheet she was holding. "I'm laundry tier," she said. "You're on the domestic register. Close enough." Parwick finally looked up, and his expression said plainly that he had already had this argument with himself and lost. "Every other name on the list has either given notice or gone home ill. You're available. The post is filled. Collect your new uniform from the house stores before you go up." He left before she could say anything else. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Dana crossed herself. Wren watched her do it. "That bad?" "You know the twins," Dana said. It was not a question. Everyone knew the twins. Even down in the laundry, even among the people who would never set foot above the 3rd floor, the story of Princes Aldrich and Riven had filtered down like smoke through floorboards. 2 boys, 10 years old, half feral since their mother died in childbed, and their father shut himself behind a wall of cold efficiency and good governance. 17 nursemaids in under a year. Furniture destroyed. 1 wall scorched by a partial shift that shouldn't have been possible in a child that age. "Do they bite?" Wren asked. Dana looked at her steadily. No one stayed long enough to find out. Wren considered this. Then she picked her sheet back up, finished wringing it, and hung it on the line. "Right," she said. "I'll need the morning off the rota." The uniform from the house stores was too small. It always was. The stores kept standard sizes. And Wren was not a standard size. which was a fact she had made her peace with in the same quiet way she had made her peace with most facts about herself. She took it back to her bunk, let out the seams with the small kit she kept for exactly this purpose, and changed in the gray morning light. Her work papers sat on top of her box where she always kept them. She didn't need to look at the stamp. She knew what it said. Omega suppressed, TR4. She had been classified at birth, same as everyone. The stamp meant her wolf was defective, couldn't fully shift, couldn't fully sense. The healers said it was metabolic, common enough, they said, in omegas of her build. She had believed it the way you believe something you've never had, cause to question. The wolf was there, she could feel it sometimes, a dim warmth, like an ember that had been banked too long. It gave her nothing useful. She had stopped expecting it to. She tucked the papers into her kit and headed for the stairs. The Upper East Wing was a different palace. She had been in the lower corridors her entire time at Ironmore. The servants' passages, the kitchen halls, the laundry and the storage and the underbelly of the place where the real work happened. Up here, the ceilings were higher. The floors were stone that had been smoothed to something close to silk. The windows were tall, and the light came through them at an angle that turned the dust in the air to gold. It smelled different. She noticed it before she could name it a shift in the air. Something cleaner and older at once, like pine resin and cold stone, and beneath both of those, something she had no word for, something that pressed very faintly against the inside of her chest. The ember in her stirred. Barely. The smallest possible movement. She ignored it. She had a job to start. She found the nursery door at the end of the east corridor. She could hear something through it. Two voices, both raised, both young, arguing with the particular viciousness of brothers who know exactly which words will land hardest. Wren set her hand on the door handle. She took one breath. She pushed it open. The sound from inside stopped. Two boys. One destroyed room. Wren stood in the doorway and took it in without moving. An overturned wardrobe, a chair with 3 legs. Scorch marks climbing the east wall in a pattern that looked almost deliberate, like something had pressed its heat against the stone and held it there. Every window was intact, which struck her as the most surprising detail in the room. The boys were in the center of it all. They had been arguing. She could see it in the way they were still positioned facing each other, chests forward, the particular braced stance of children mid-fight. The elder one, broader and restless-eyed, had claws where his fingernails should have been. The younger stood very still with his hands at his sides, and something about his stillness was more alarming than the claws. They were not arguing anymore. They were looking at her. The elder one moved first. He stepped to the side and circled her. Not aggressive, not playful, but deliberate in the way of a wolf following a scent. It needed to map completely. She held still and let him. He came around to her left, leaned in close enough that she could feel the warmth off his skin, and inhaled. The claws retracted. The younger boy, Riven, had not moved at all. He was watching her with gray eyes that were too old for his face, and when he finally spoke, his voice was very quiet. "You smell like rain before a storm," he said. "Our mother used to say that about the forest." Wren had no answer for that. She didn't know what it meant. She filed it in the same place she filed most things she didn't understand, quietly, without ceremony, and looked around the room. She found a chair with all 4 legs still attached and righted it. She set her kit beside it. Then she sat down. Neither boy moved. The elder Aldrich, she would learn, was watching her with narrowed eyes, waiting for something. For a command, maybe. A threat. Some version of the authority every adult brought in here like a shield, as if you could manage a grief-fractured wolf with a stern voice and a schedule. Wren folded her hands in her lap. "I'm Wren," she said. "I'm not going to tell you to clean this up. It's already done and I wasn't here for it." She looked around the room again. "What do you want for breakfast?" Silence. Then Aldrich said slowly, like he was testing a trap, "Eggs." "All right," Wren said. "Riven?" The younger boy blinked. It was clear no one had asked him a separate question in some time. "The same," he said. "She sent for eggs." They came. The boys ate at the table she had cleared of debris, sitting across from her, watching her the way animals watch something unfamiliar, not with hostility, but with the concentrated attention of creatures deciding whether a thing is safe. She did not perform for them. She did not smile too broadly or speak too carefully. She ate her own breakfast and asked Aldrich whether the scorch marks were his or Riven's, and he said his, and she nodded like that was reasonable information, which seemed to confuse him entirely. The morning passed. She found a broom and swept. She did not ask them to help, and did not make a point of not asking them to help. Riven eventually picked up the other end of a broken shelf without being told and held it while she stacked books back onto the intact one. They did not speak while they worked. The silence was not uncomfortable. By midday they were arguing again, but the sound of it was different, lighter, faster. The argument of boys who were arguing because it was interesting rather than because the alternative was grief. Wren sat in her chair and read from a book she've found in the debris and let them. By late afternoon, Riven was asleep. He had come to sit beside her an hour before. Not asking, not announcing, simply migrating across the room in small increments until he was close enough to lean. Then he leaned. His head was a warm weight against her arm. His breathing slowed. Something moved through Wren that she had no word for. Her wolf, that dim and buried thing, pressed close to the surface of her thoughts. It did not stir the way it had in the corridor, that barely there flicker she had dismissed before reaching the door. This was different. Steadier. It settled into her chest like something returning to a place it recognized. Family, it said. Wren frowned at the word, held it at arm's length, filed it away. Aldrich had fallen asleep on the rug 20 minutes earlier, one arm flung over his eyes, his breathing as deep and uncomplicated as a much younger child's. The room smelled of old stone and the pine resin from the fire Wren had built in the small hearth when the afternoon turned cold. Outside, the sky had darkened to the blue-gray of early evening. She did not notice the door open. She did not notice the footsteps stop. She did not notice any of it until she felt it. A weight in the air, a change in the room's pressure, the way the space rearranges itself around a significant presence. She looked up. A man stood at the half-open door. Tall, dark hair silvering at the edges, a jaw that looked like it had been set against something for a very long time. He was dressed without ceremony, but there was nothing casual about him. Nothing about him suggested he had ever in his life been anything other than exactly what he was. He was looking at his sons. The expression on his face was not one she could name. It moved through something that was almost pain before it resolved into something else, something quieter and rawer that he seemed to have no idea he was showing. Then he looked at her. She met his gaze. She did not look away. Across the palace, alone in his private rooms, a man who had once been a wolf paused in the middle of the corridor. He pressed one hand flat against the stone wall. Something in him had gone very still, and then very loud, and then still again. It said one word. Finally. She heard him before she saw him, not his footsteps. Those were quiet for a man his size, which she noted without knowing why she noted it. What she heard was the change in the corridor, the way the air shifted, the way the two palace guards stationed at the far end straightened without being told to. Wren had a tray of breakfast dishes balanced in both hands and was halfway to the kitchen stairs when he stepped into the passage ahead of her. She stopped. He was not in formal dress. Dark trousers, a plain shirt open at the throat, sleeves pushed to the elbows. He looked like a man who had been up before the palace finished sleeping and had not particularly cared what he put on to prove it. None of that made him less than what he was. If anything, it made it worse. There was nowhere for the eye to land that wasn't him. Her wolf went very still. "You," he said, not unkindly, just precise. "The nursemaid." "Yes, my lord." "Who authorized the assignment?" She kept her grip on the tray. "Steward Parwick, my lord. Crisis staffing. I can show you my work papers if you'd like. I have them in my kit upstairs." He looked at her for a moment. Something in his expression was measuring, but not unkindly, not the way men usually measured servants. He was not looking at her classification, he was looking at her face. "Bring them," he said. She went up. She came back. She handed him the folded papers without apology and watched him open them. His hands were broad and careful. She noted that without meaning to, the same way she had noted his footsteps. He read the stamp, Omega suppressed, TR4. His jaw tightened, not in contempt. Something closer to the opposite of contempt, actually, though she couldn't have named it. He folded the papers and handed them back. "How did you manage them?" he asked. "I didn't, my lord." A pause. "Explain that." "I sat down," Wren said. "I didn't try to manage anything. I just sat in the room with them. They did the rest." He looked at her the way people looked at something that didn't fit the category they had prepared for it. Like she was a word in a language he spoke fluently that had suddenly meant something different. She waited. The tray was getting heavy. She did not shift it. "Very well," he said finally. His voice was measured. Formal. The voice of a man returning to the correct distance after straying slightly too close. "Continue as assigned. If there are difficulties, bring them to the steward." "Yes, my lord." He held her gaze for one beat longer than the conversation required. Then he walked away. Wren stood in the corridor until she could no longer hear his footsteps. She became aware, slowly, that her wolf had pressed close to the surface of her thoughts the entire time he was standing in front of her, not urgently, not loudly, just leaning toward him the way a plant leans toward a window, quiet and constant, and entirely without her permission. She tightened her grip on the tray and went downstairs. Across the palace, in a study that smelled of parchment and cold tea, the king was telling his morning advisors that the nursemaid situation had been resolved. The room held 3 men. 2 of them noted the update and moved on to the water rights dispute with the Eastern Holdings. The third set down his cup with the particular care of a man who had trained himself out of any motion that might be read as reaction. "The new nursemaid," said Lord Physic-Crest, and his voice was precisely as mild as it always was. "Where was she sourced?" "Lower domestic register," said the advisor nearest the window. "Laundry staff. Parwick pulled her this morning when the last of the candidates withdrew. Her name?" The advisor checked his notes. "Calloway. Wren Calloway. Tier 4 Omega, suppressed classification." Crest nodded once. He picked up his cup again. He asked no further questions, which was itself a kind of answer, though no one in the room was listening for it. He excused himself before the water rights discussion concluded. His office was in the medical wing, 3 corridors and a staircase from the king's study. Quiet at this hour, smelling of dried herbs and the faint chemical sharpness of tinctures. He closed the door. He stood at his desk for a moment without sitting. Then he went to the cabinet behind his chair. Not the upper cabinet, where he kept the medicines the court used freely. The lower one. The one with the iron lock that required a key he kept on his person at all times. He unlocked it. He opened it. Inside, arranged with the careful precision of a man who understood that small things, improperly managed, became large ones. A row of vials, each sealed, each clear. And beneath them, a ledger. And beneath the ledger, a single folded document, the ink on it old enough to have faded from black to the color of dried rust. He took out the document. He unfolded it. He read the name at the top. Then he reached past the document and closed his hand around one of the vials. Calloway, the old ink said. He had not seen that name in years. He had not expected to see it again. He set the vial on the desk with great care and stood looking at it for a long time. 3 days in, and the nursery had a rhythm. Wren had not imposed it. That was the thing she was still turning over in her mind as she made the beds each morning. She had not built the routine so much as discovered it. The way you discover a path through a wood that was already there before you arrived. Aldrich woke first, loud and immediate, his wolf close to the surface the way it always was in the early hours. Riven woke second, slower, needing a few minutes before he was willing to inhabit the day. Wren had breakfast waiting before either of them asked for it. This seemed to matter to them more than she would have expected. She had also stopped asking herself about the plant. It sat on the shelf beside the window, a small clay pot that had been on the sill when she arrived. Dry soil and a thin gray stalk that she had assumed was dead. 4 days later, it had 3 leaves. She moved it once, experimentally, to the far side of the room. By morning, it had bent itself back toward the corner where she slept. straining at such an angle she could not pretend it was following the light. She moved it back. She did not mention it to anyone. The warmth in her hands was harder to ignore. It had started the second night, when Riven woke screaming from a dream and she had gone to him without thinking, pressing her palm to his hair the way you'd soothe any frightened child. The warmth had come out of her and into him like water finding its level. He had gone quiet within seconds. She had sat beside him until his breathing evened out, and then she had gone back to her cot and lain there in the dark, pressing her hands together, trying to feel it again. She couldn't, in the dark and the quiet. It was only there when she needed it. She filed it away. She had a job. On the third day, she took them outside. The palace gardens were walled and wide, smelling of damp earth and the particular cold sweetness of boxwood hedges in early spring. Neither boy had been out in weeks, she could tell by the way they both stopped at the garden gate and breathed, like they had forgotten what outside smelled like. Aldrich recovered first, as he always did, and immediately sprinted for the far hedge. Riven followed at a walk, his hands in his pockets, his gray eyes moving over the garden with the quiet inventory of someone cataloging a place they wanted to remember. Wren sat on a stone bench and let them go. The sun was pale but present. She turned her face up to it. "Why doesn't your wolf come out?" She opened her eyes. Aldrich had circled back and was standing in front of her, slightly out of breath, with a leaf caught in his hair. He asked questions the way he did everything directly, without preamble, as if the answer was already waiting and she was simply slow in producing it. "It's suppressed," Wren said. He frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means it doesn't work properly. It's a classification." Aldrich looked skeptical in the thorough, uncomplicated way of 10-year-olds. "That's not what it smells like." "What does it smell like?" He considered this with more seriousness than she expected. "Like something waiting," he said finally. "Like before a storm, when everything gets quiet." He shrugged, already losing interest in his own answer, and ran back toward the hedges. Wren sat with that for a moment. Then the quality of the air changed. She recognized it before she turned that same rearrangement of a room, the way space accommodated itself around a particular presence. She heard his footsteps on the garden path and kept her eyes on the boys. He came to stand beside her, not close, the appropriate distance of a man who had decided, deliberately, where his feet were going to be. "They haven't been out here," Raylan said. He wasn't accusing anyone. He was simply noting it, with the flatness of a man noting his own failure from a safe distance. 3 weeks, by my count," Wren said. A pause. "How did you get Aldrich to agree? He refused every time He stopped himself. "I didn't ask," Wren said. "I just opened the gate." The boys were chasing each other through the hedges now, Aldrich howling at a volume that would have concerned anyone who didn't know him. Riven was laughing. The sound of it landed somewhere in Wren's chest like a small, warm stone. Raylan was quiet beside her. She could feel him looking at them. "My mate loved this garden," he said. The words came out with the careful evenness of something that had been carried a long time. Wren did not turn to look at him. She understood, without being told, that he had not meant to say it, that the garden had said it for him. "It shows," she said. "It's been tended well." Another silence. The good kind, or close to it. His arm was beside hers on the bench, not touching, separated by a hand's width of cold spring air. She was aware of the distance the way you're aware of a sound just below hearing, felt more than known. Her wolf pressed against her thoughts and said nothing, just leaned. He stood first. He always would. "Thank you," he said, and his voice was back to what it usually was measured, appropriate, a king's voice. "For bringing them out." She nodded. He left. She sat in the garden until the boys tired themselves out, and then she took them back upstairs, and she made dinner, and she did not think about the way his arm had felt beside hers without touching. That night she poured her cup of water, drank half, and stopped. Something was wrong with it. Not wrong badly, not spoiled or brackish, just faintly metallic, the way water tasted when it had sat too long in old pipes. She had been drinking from the pitcher on her table every night since she moved upstairs. She poured it out. She filled her cup from the washroom tap instead. She slept better than she had in years. So deeply, so completely, that when she woke to the darkness of the middle of the night, she lay still for a moment, not knowing what had woken her. Then she realized. Her wolf was awake. Not dim. Not distant. Not the faint press of a banked ember she had spent her life learning to ignore. Awake fully. Loudly and completely awake, for the first time she could remember. Filling her chest with something that felt less like instinct and more like language. And it was not saying family. It was saying mate. The library was empty at that hour, which was why she chose it. Wren had waited until both boys were deeply asleep. Aldrich sprawled diagonally across his bed as though he had fallen from a height. Riven curled small and still on his side. She had stood between their cots for a moment, listening to the easy rhythm of their breathing, then taken her candle and gone. The library occupied the whole of the palace's east corner on the second floor. It smelled of dust and old leather and the faint mineral tang of cold stone. And at this hour, it held no one. She moved through the shelves until she found the medical and classification records, 3 rows of volumes, organized by year. She pulled the oldest one she could find on Omega Physiology and set it on the long reading table. She had been searching for an hour when she found it. A passage, 30 years old, written by a healer whose name she didn't recognize, arguing against the standard classification system. Suppression in omegas, the healer had written, is rarely biological in origin. It is more frequently environmental. The question we do not ask often enough is not what is suppressing the wolf, but what has been introduced to suppress it. Wren read the paragraph 3 times. She did not hear the door. The library closes at 9th bell. She turned. Raylan stood in the doorway with a book already in his hand. He had clearly come with a purpose of his own and found her instead. He looked at her the way he always looked at her, like she required a category he hadn't invented yet. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't realize. I'll go." "Stay." He said it before he seemed to decide to say it. A pause followed, brief, in which he appeared to recalibrate. "The hour is not strictly enforced. What are you reading?" She closed the volume before he could see the title. Research. He crossed to the table without asking permission. Kings didn't, and sat in the chair across from her. The candlelight reached him, and she made herself look at the books instead of his face, which was easier to manage. They talked about the twins first. That was safe. She told him what she had noticed, that Riven needed quiet before he could be approached in the mornings, that Aldrich's aggression was mostly boredom, that both of them responded to being asked questions more than being given instructions. Raylan listened without interrupting, which she hadn't expected. He had the quality of a man who had learned to perform attention and had, somewhere along the way, developed the actual thing. "I don't know how to just be with them," he said at one point. His voice was lower than usual. The King's register had slipped into something unguarded. "I know how to provide for them. I know how to ensure they're safe and educated, and I know the administrative parts. But Aldrich asked me last week to sit with him while he fell asleep, and I didn't know what to do, so I told him I had correspondence." "Did you?" Wren asked. A pause. "No." The candle between them burned low. Outside the library's high windows, the palace had gone fully quiet. He asked about her family. She said there wasn't much to tell, which was true in a way she didn't yet understand. He accepted this with a nod and then, unexpectedly, told her his mate's name. "Sarah," he said, like it was something he needed to put down somewhere outside himself for a moment. Wren held very still. She understood she had just been handed something heavy and private. She did not look away from him. She would have known what to do, he said. With the boys, she always knew. "I think you know more than you believe," Wren said. "You knew enough to stand outside their door and watch them sleep. You knew enough to come down to the garden. That's not nothing." He looked at her. She had said too much. She could feel it. The conversation had tipped past what a nursemaid and a king were supposed to have. She reached for her book. He reached across the table to turn the page she had been looking at, to see what she had been reading, and his hand covered hers. Neither of them moved. The warmth in her palm pressed upward, involuntary, toward him. Her wolf lunged against the inside of her chest so hard she tightened her free hand on the table edge. He said her name. Just that. Just Wren. Quietly, in the private voice, the one that sounded like a different person, entirely softer and less certain and more real than anything else he had shown her. She looked up. He was close. She had not tracked how close he had gotten, leaning across the table, and now the distance between them was the length of a breath, and his gray eyes were on her face with an expression she could not allow herself to name. The pull was a physical thing. It moved through her like heat. She stood. "I need to check on the boys," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of it, distantly. She left before he could answer. In the corridor outside, she pressed her back to the wall and stood there in the dark, her hand still warm where his had covered it. Her wolf was not whispering. It was not murmuring or leaning or pressing gently. It was screaming, "Go back, go back, go back." She pressed her eyes shut. She did not go back. In the morning, Crest came to the nursery. She heard his knock before she saw him 3 light taps, unhurried. The knock of a man who had never needed to demand entry to anything because he had never been refused. He stood in the doorway with a small wrapped package in his hands and the mild, warm expression on his face. "Forgive the intrusion," he said. "I make a point of checking on all new staff welfare. Standard practice." He held out the package. "A health tonic. We provide them to all Omega classified servants in the upper quarters. I helps with the adjustment." His eyes were kind. His voice was gentle. She took it. She thanked him. He smiled and left. Wren set the package on the breakfast table and unwrapped it, a small corked bottle, the liquid inside pale and faintly golden. She poured a measure into her cup. She drank half of it before Riven, crossing the room for his own breakfast, leaned down and sniffed it. The sound that came out of him was not a child's sound. The cup hit the floor. The liquid spread across the stone in a slow, silent stain. Wren stared at it. Riven stood rigid beside her, his small hands in fists, a low, continuous growl coming from somewhere deep in his chest. She looked at the spilled tonic. She looked at him. "Riven," she said carefully, "what does it smell like?" He looked up at her with his father's gray eyes. "Wrong," he said. The notes came through the steward. That was how Wren knew. Not from silence. Silence could mean anything but from the handwriting on the folded papers that Parwick delivered each morning to the nursery door. Formal script. Precise margins. The twins' schedule written out in full, with meal times and lesson hours and exercise periods, as though the boys were problems to be optimized rather than children who needed their father to sit with them while they fell asleep. She read the first note. She set it on the table. She did not read the second one. The week that followed was its own particular kind of difficult. Her wolf had gone unreliable since the tonic. That was the only word she had for it, unreliable. Some hours it was present and clear, pressing close to her thoughts with a warmth she was beginning to depend on. Other hours it simply wasn't there. Not quiet. Absent. Like a candle that had been burning steadily and then wasn't, and you couldn't be certain if it had gone out or if you had simply stopped being able to see it. She did not know which possibility frightened her more. She did not tell anyone. She had no one to tell. The twins noticed Raylan's absence within 2 days. They did not burn anything or flood any corridors. Instead, Aldrich started leaving his breakfast half-eaten. Riven, who had been sleeping well for the first time in weeks, began waking early again and sitting at the window with his knees pulled to his chest, watching the courtyard below. She did not know what to do with that kind of sorrow. She could only sit near it and let it know it wasn't alone. On the 5th day, the steward came to tell her that her presence would be required in the great hall. There was a formal presentation. Her attendance was expected as part of the household staff the boys were to observe from the upper gallery. She brought them up. She stood at the back. The great hall smelled of beeswax candles and formal cold, the kind that came from high ceilings and stone floors, and too many people trying to perform composure. Wren found a place near the gallery rail and held Aldrich's shoulder with one hand, because his wolf was too close to the surface and the crowd below was giving him trouble. The woman arrived with a northern delegation, 6 attendants, a fur-trimmed cloak the color of winter birch. She was composed in the way of someone who had been trained to it from childhood, Not stiff, but assembled. Every part of her placed with intention. She was beautiful. Ren registered this without drama, the same way she registered weather. Raylan stood at the base of the dais steps to receive her. He wore his formal expression, the one that looked like his face had been shut and locked. He bowed. The woman curtsied. The court watched with the concentrated attention of people who had been waiting for this. He did not look pleased. He also did not look displeased. He looked like nothing. He looked like a man doing a necessary thing with great efficiency, which was perhaps the saddest version of the same outcome. Ren watched him for exactly as long as it took to understand what she was seeing. Then she looked at the candles instead. Beside her, Aldrich had gone very still. She did not look at his face. She took the boys back to the nursery when the presentation concluded. She fed them dinner. She read to Riven until he dozed. She mended a tear in Aldrich's spare shirt with the small kit she kept in her pocket and told herself she was fine. Which she was. She was always fine. It was the one thing she was consistently good at. It was not until she was alone, sitting on her cot in the dark after both boys had finally slept, that she allowed herself to feel the full weight of the afternoon pressing down on her chest. She had no right to it. She knew that. She was the nursemaid. She was Tier 4, suppressed, a laundry worker who had been handed an upstairs assignment by a tired steward on a difficult morning. She had no claim on anything this palace held, least of all on the way a man's arm had almost touched hers in a garden, or the way her name had sounded in the dark of a library. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum and breathed. Her wolf was silent. Entirely and completely silent. She had never felt so alone in her own body. Across the palace, Lord Physic Crest was sitting in Raylan's private study with a cup of warm tea and the particular satisfaction of a man whose contingency plan was proceeding well. He spoke warmly of the northern match. He noted the lady's family connections, her health, her temperament. He said nothing about the nursemaid. He did not need to. He was already thinking about the medical annex. He had found a name in the archives 2 days ago. A healer. A date of birth. A notation he himself had written 22 years ago, which he had believed safely buried. He had begun the process of locating and removing the primary file this evening. He was thorough. He had always been thorough. He did not believe there was a secondary record. He had no reason to believe there was a secondary record. He was not worried. Back in the nursery, Aldrich was not asleep. He crossed the room quietly, which was unusual for him. He moved through spaces the way he moved through arguments, loudly and without apology. But he came to Ren's cot and climbed up beside her and settled there without a word. She let him. After a long moment, he said, "Papa looks at you the way he used to look at Mama's portrait." Ren did not answer. She had no answer that was safe to give, so she sat with it the way she sat with most things quietly, without flinching, taking up exactly as much space as she had been given. Aldrich fell asleep against her arm. She looked at the plant on the windowsill, the one that had been dead when she arrived, that had grown 3 leaves, that she had watched for weeks with careful scientific detachment. In the morning, it had bloomed. All of it. Overnight, in the dark. In a room where no one was watching small white flowers opening all the way up the stem, more of them than the plant had any right to produce, filling the nursery with a scent like rain on warm stone. She stared at it for a long time. Then she thought about the healer's passage she had read in the library. About suppression. About what had been introduced. And for the first time, she thought, what if the question I should be asking is not what is wrong with me? What if it is who decided there was? That same night, Lord Physic Crest worked by lamplight. His office was quiet at this hour. The medical wing emptied after the evening rounds, and he had learned long ago that the best work, the careful work, the work that required no witnesses, happened in the space between midnight and the first bell of morning. He was not a man who needed much sleep. He had always considered this an advantage. The file was thin. A woman's name. A date of birth. 3 pages of notes in his own handwriting from 22 years ago, when he had been younger and the old king had still been alive and the thing had seemed, in the way of necessary things, very simple. He held the pages over the lamp flame and watched them go. The fire was small and clean. No smoke worth noting. In 4 minutes there was nothing left but ash, which he pressed flat with the back of a letter opener and then swept into the grate. He was thorough. He had always been thorough. He believed, sitting back in his chair with his hands folded and his expression settled, that he had been sufficient. He did not know about the second copy. He could not have known. The healer who had hidden it had been a careful woman, careful in the specific way of people who love someone they cannot protect openly, who plan for contingencies they pray will never be needed. She had filed it under a patient registry number in the medical annex, cross-referenced to nothing, attached to a name that was not her own. A record that looked, to anyone scanning the shelves, like an unremarkable intake document for a patient who had been treated and discharged. She had hidden it where a healer would think to look. And her daughter, 22 years later, had gone looking. Wren had waited until the boys were settled and Aldrich's breathing had gone deep, and even before she lit her candle and slipped out, she told herself she was going to the medical annex for research. Records on omega suppression. The healer's passage from the library had been turning over in her mind for days, what has been introduced, and she had run out of patience for telling herself it was nothing. The annex smelled of dried herbs and old paper, cold in the way of rooms that held mostly records rather than people. She found the relevant shelves by process of elimination, pulling volumes and scanning indexes by candlelight, her fingers moving through the pages with the methodical patience she brought to everything. She almost missed it. The registry number was filed between 2 intake records from a fever outbreak, sandwiched so unremarkably that she had already moved past it before something pulled her back. Her wolf, which had been quiet all evening, went very still. She pulled the document. She read her mother's name first. She recognized it from the single mention in the laundry records from her childhood, the name on the death certificate she had obtained when she was 16, the piece of paper that told her who she had come from without telling her anything else. She read the date of birth, her own. She read the notation about the father, King Aldous Ashvane, acknowledged, sealed by royal order. She sat down on the floor. She was not aware of deciding to do it. Her legs simply stopped holding her. The candle was still in her hand. She held it carefully. She read the document again, slowly, from the beginning, because the first time through she had not been reading, she had been receiving, which was different, and her mind needed the second pass to actually process the words rather than just absorb their shape. Father. King Aldous Ashvane, half-sister to the current king, half-blood to his sons, who had pressed their faces against her sleeve and said she smelled like rain before a storm. And at the bottom, in Crest's careful, familiar script, suppression administered, ongoing, by order of Lord Physic D. Crest, to prevent destabilization of succession. Ongoing. She sat on the floor of the medical annex for a long time. Around her the shelves stood silent, holding 20 years of the palace's quiet histories. The candle burned down 1/4 of an inch. Somewhere above her, the palace slept. Her wolf did not speak. It simply waited, with the patience of something that had always known this moment was coming and had decided, long before she did, what came next. She stood up. She folded the document and put it inside her dress, against her skin. She picked up her candle. She walked out of the annex and turned toward the east wing, toward the corridor that led to the king's private study, where his light was often still burning at this hour. She had one clear thought as she walked. If this is said, it needs to be said tonight. Before the document is found missing, before Crest does his secondary check and discovers she has been in the annex, she moved quickly. In his office, Crest had been awake for 11 minutes when the instinct found him. He was not certain what triggered it. A sound, a change in the air, some professional caution that had kept him employed and safe for 28 years. He put on his coat. He took his lamp. He walked to the medical annex. The door was unlocked. He went to the shelves. He found the gap between the 2 intake records from the fever outbreak. He stood very still for a moment with his lamp raised and the empty space where the document had been sitting for 22 years. Then he moved to his private study and pulled the cord that rang, 2 floors down, in the quarters of the 2 guards he trusted most. He wrote one instruction on a slip of paper. He did not write why. Wren Calloway, the paper said. Find her. Bring her to the medical wing for welfare assessment. Do not let her reach the king. Ren was 3 corridors from Raylan's study when she turned the corner. 2 guards were waiting. They knew her name before she spoke. They did not hurt her. That was the first thing she noted. Walking between the 2 guards toward the medical wing, they were not rough, not unkind. They were simply present on either side of her, and the message of their presence was clear enough without any roughness required. She was being taken somewhere. She was not being asked. She kept her hand pressed flat against her chest, or the document sat folded inside her dress. The medical wing at this hour was cold and quiet, smelling of herbs and lamp oil and something underneath both that she had never been able to name. They put her in a small room used for assessments. A cot, a chair, a window too high and too narrow to be useful. The door closed. She heard the lock turn. She did not panic. She sat on the cot and pressed her hands together and thought. The document was still with her. That was what mattered. As long as the document existed and she was alive, what she knew could still be spoken. She did not have to wait long. Crest came in alone. He carried his lamp in one hand and nothing else, and he set it on the small table by the chair with the same unhurried precision he brought to everything. He sat. He looked at her with the expression she had seen on his face a dozen times in the nursery doorway, measured, benevolent, a healer assessing a patient's condition. "You found it," he said. Not a question. "Yes," Ren said. He folded his hands in his lap. "Then you know what you are. And you understand, I hope, why I cannot allow you to take that information to the king." She looked at him steadily. "You've been poisoning me since I was born." "I've been managing a situation," he said, "that your father created and then died without resolving. You were never in danger. The potion is mild. Your life has been entirely ordinary." "My life has been," she said, and her voice did not waver. "What you made it." Something moved across his face that might have been discomfort. He dismissed it. "I'm going to administer a corrective dose. You'll feel somewhat tired. In the morning, we will arrange for your transfer back to the lower domestic register, and this will end quietly for everyone." He reached into his coat. She did not run. There was nowhere to run. The door was locked and he was between her and it, and she had known, sitting on the floor of the medical annex with the document in her hands, that it might come to this. She had come to find Raylan anyway. The choice had already been made. The needle went into her arm before she could react. The cold spread up from the injection site. Immediately she recognized it now. The quality of it. The particular deadening sensation she had lived inside her entire life and never understood. Her wolf had been building toward something all evening. It felt the intrusion, and it did not accept it. The cold met the heat already rising through her and stopped. Her hands lit up, not warmth this time. Light, real and visible, pouring from her palms in the same soft gold as the plant's flowers, filling the small room with something that had no medical explanation and no classification number and no place in any document Crest had ever managed. He stepped back. She got to her feet. In the nursery, 2 floors above and half a corridor away, Aldrich and Riven sat bolt upright in their beds at the same moment, not woken by a sound. Woken by something below sound, a pull in the blood that dragged them out of sleep and onto their feet before they were fully conscious. Aldrich said her name. Riven was already at the door. In the king's study, Raylan was working through correspondence he was not reading when the pain hit him. Not pain, exactly. More like something that had been held at a great distance for a very long time. Suddenly closing that distance all at once, pressing against his sternum from the inside with a force that dropped him forward onto one knee with his hand braced against the desk. His wolf did not say mate this time. It said no. He found the boys in the nursery doorway. Both of them. Standing in the dark in their nightclothes, Aldrich's hand outstretched, pointing down the corridor toward the medical wing with the absolute certainty of a wolf who knew where his pack was. Raylan ran. He found the door. He did not knock. The wood gave under his shoulder and the lock tore free, and he came through into a room full of gold light to find Crest standing against the far wall, and Wren on the floor with her hands lit, and a syringe on the stone beside her, dropped and empty. The sight of her on the floor did something to him that he had no word for. He had one feeling, loud and without ambiguity. It moved through him the way his alpha voice moved from the center of him outward, filling everything. Step away from her. His voice filled the corridor behind him. Both guards sank to their knees without understanding why. Crest did not sink. He was not a wolf. But he went very still, and the second syringe in his hand trembled slightly before he thought to control it. He raised it. Ren's hand shot out and closed around his wrist. The light in her palms flared. Crest made a sound, not of pain, but of something involuntary, the sound of a man whose careful control had been interrupted by something he had never accounted for. The syringe fell. Ren's hand dropped. The light faded slowly, like embers cooling. Raylon crossed the room and went to one knee in front of her. His hands found her face, her jaw, looking at her with the expression he had kept from her for weeks in the library and the garden, and every corridor they had stood in together. There was nothing managed about it now, nothing measured. She looked up at him. The gold light had gone from her palms, but it had left something behind, a warmth that settled into the room and stayed. "I need to tell you who I am," she said. Raylon had listened to everything she said in the corridor outside the medical wing, crouched beside her on the cold stone floor, his hands still on her face. She had told him plainly, the way she did everything. The document, her mother's name, the notation about her father, the 22 years of what Crest had called management. She had not softened it. She had not asked him to believe her before he was ready. He had been very still for a long time after she finished. Then he had said, quietly, "The Great Hall." She had nodded. That was what she wanted. If it was said in private, it could be buried in private. She had spent her whole life being something that powerful men decided could be quietly managed. She was done with quiet. The court assembled at dawn. The great hall smelled of cold stone and beeswax candles lit in haste. The particular atmosphere of a room full of people who had been woken before they were ready and were performing composure over their alarm. The council. The senior advisors. The household heads. Lords who had traveled to the palace for the Northern Match presentation and had not yet departed. They filled the long benches in their various states of dishevelment, watching the dais with careful, measuring faces. Raylon stood at the front of the hall, not at the base of the steps this time, at the top, where he belonged, with his full authority around him like something physical. Ren stood beside him. She was still in her nursemaid's dress. She had not had time to change and had not asked. She held the document in both hands, and she did not look at the assembled court, because if she looked at them she would see what they thought of her, and she needed to think clearly. She presented the document to the court archivist, first not to Raylon, not to the council, but to the office whose function was specifically to confirm or refute the authenticity of palace records. The archivist was a small, precise woman who had spent 40 years in that role and had no patience for theater. She examined the document for 4 minutes in complete silence while the hall waited. Crest was escorted in during those 4 minutes. He looked, as he always did, exactly as he intended to look. Composed. Professionally concerned. The healer summoned to account for an apparent misunderstanding. His voice, when he spoke to address the council, was mild and measured and entirely convincing. "The document is a forgery," he said. "The young woman has clearly been under significant stress. I fear my treatment of her suppression condition may have had unforeseen psychological effects, for which I take full responsibility." The hall murmured. Several council members shifted toward visible relief. This was a story that fit comfortably into existing categories. Ren kept her eyes on the archivist. 2 small figures pushed through the back of the hall. The guards tried to redirect them. Aldrich went under the first guard's arm before the man had time to react, and Riven walked through the gap his brother made with the calm of someone who has decided that authority applies to other people. They crossed the full length of the great hall in the particular silence that falls when 2 children walk with absolute, unhurried certainty toward a thing that matters. They stopped beside Ren. Aldrich stood on her left. Riven on her right. Neither of them said anything. Neither of them needed to. The court watched. A king's sons had made a choice, and everyone in the hall understood what it meant. The archivist looked up from the document. "The seal is authentic," she said. "Royal Archive, dated 23 years past. The document has not been altered." Crest was taken by two of Raylan's personal guard, not roughly, because he did not resist. He walked out of the great hall with his hands at his sides and his face still composed, which was perhaps the most frightening thing about him. Even at the end, he was managing the situation, deciding how he wanted to be seen. He was no longer the one who decided. The classification dissolution was read into the formal record by the court secretary in a voice that did not waver. Ren Calloway, formerly registered as Omega Suppressed Tier 4, classification revoked in full, status corrected to reflect true bloodline, illegitimate daughter of the late King Aldu. Bass Ashfane, acknowledged. The hall was very quiet after that. Ren stood at the front of it with the document still in her hands, and two boys pressed against her sides, and she looked at the assembled court of Ironmore. These people who had walked past her in corridors and handed her linen and never once looked at her face, and she felt something settle in her chest that had no name, she had been taught. She had always taken up exactly as much space as she was given. She was done with that too. Raylan looked at her from across the dais. She had been aware of him all morning, the way she had always been aware of him, that particular pressure in the air, the way her wolf oriented toward him without asking permission. But this was different. The distance between them felt different now. Not the careful distance of a king managing his own wanting, something that had been held at arm's length for weeks and had simply run out of distance to hold. He crossed the dais. He said her name, not as a title, not as an address, as a question that meant something much larger than her name. "Are you here? Are you real? Is this the thing I have been moving toward since the first night I stood outside a door and heard my son sleeping like they had finally found solid ground?" She answered the only way that was true. She tilted her head. Slow and deliberate. Exposing the line of her throat, not because she had been told to, not because destiny required it, but because she had read every document and survived every needle and walked the full length of this hall. And she wanted to, because choosing was the thing that had been taken from her at birth, and she was taking it back. His mouth found her throat with the gentleness of something that had been patient for a very long time. The warmth that moved through her was not the suppression breaking. It was the bond sealing, complete and certain, and shot through with the particular quality of things that were always true and are simply, finally, being said aloud. She turned her head. She found his throat in return. She claimed him back. The court of Ironmore witnessed it in silence. Afterward, in the corridor while behind them, the hall began the slow, loud business of absorbing what it had just seen. Aldrich looked at his brother. "I told you," he said, with the satisfaction of someone who has been right for a very long time. "She smelled like ours." Riven considered this. "You said rain." Aldrich shrugged. "Same thing." 1 year later, the palace gardens were full of sound. Aldrich's voice carried from somewhere beyond the far hedges. He was arguing about something, which meant he was happy. Riven's quieter response drifted back, which meant he was winning. The sound of them moved through the garden like weather, filling it up, and Ren listened to it the way she listened to the fire in the nursery hearth and the rain on the east wing windows and all the sounds she had catalogued over the past year as the particular music of a life she had not known, was allowed to want. She was kneeling in the south border with both hands in the soil. She had already made the head gardener anxious twice this morning. She found she did not mind. The plant ran the full length of the south wall behind her. It had reached the corner by midsummer and kept going, climbing the stone with a steadiness that no one could explain, and no one had been able to document accurately, because the flowers were a color that defied the existing botanical vocabulary. Not gold, not amber, not quite either. Something in between that looked different depending on the light and the hour and who was looking. The palace had received 3 letters of inquiry from academic institutions. Ren had written back to all of them. She had not been particularly informative. She heard his footsteps on the garden path before she saw him. She knew his footsteps the way she knew her own breathing, now that particular quality of presence, the way the air accommodated itself around him. She did not turn. She felt the bond between them, warm and settled, the way a room feels when the fire has been burning long enough that the walls themselves have held the heat. Not a pull anymore, not a strain, simply there, the way the best things are simply there. He crouched beside her in the dirt. He was not in formal dress. He had stopped performing at her, somewhere in the first months, and she had noticed the exact day it happened and had not said anything about it, because some things were better witnessed than named. Steward Parwick, he said, low close to her ear, is standing at the upper window with his hands clasped. I told him I was going to repot the east border, she said. He's worried I'll do it wrong. Are you going to do it wrong? Probably, she said. I'll figure it out. His mouth curved. She felt it more than saw it, the warmth of him beside her, his shoulder against hers. He reached past her to press his fingers into the soil beside her hands. He had done this before. He kept doing it. She thought he was learning something. Or perhaps just wanted to be in contact with whatever she was in contact with. Their bond hummed, low and content. A year ago, she had walked into a room full of wreckage and sat down. She had not known then what she was walking toward. She had thought she was doing a job. She had thought she was surviving, which was the only ambition she had ever been allowed. She knew now what the plant knew, what the twins had known from the first breath, that some things do not need to be told what they are, that some things simply grow toward what they recognize as theirs. Raylon's hand covered hers in the soil. She turned her palm up. She held it. From beyond the hedges, Aldrich said something insufferable. Riven laughed a real laugh, full and unhesitating, the laugh of a boy who had learned he was safe. The flowers on the south wall caught the morning light and held it, that unnamed color spreading warm across the stone. Wren closed her eyes. She stayed exactly where she was. She took up all the space she needed. And that, at last, was enough. Thank you so much for listening all the way to the end. It means everything that you stayed with Wren's story from that first morning in the laundry all the way to the garden. If this one moved you, I'd love to know. Drop a comment, tell me your favorite moment, and make sure you're following so you never miss what comes next. There are more stories waiting, more kingdoms, more impossible loves, more women who were never as small as the world tried to make them. I'll see you in the next one.